Buy, sell or rent your property with Century 21 and you could win a brand new 2-bedroom apartment on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. Visit c21prize.co.nz for your chance to win.
Welcome back to Your Property Empire. Well, joining me on the show tonight is Damien Still from McGrath Estate Agents, and we've just been joined by Charles Tarbey, Chairman and owner of Century 21 Australasia. Well, no matter whether you're a buyer or a seller, it's essential to understand the auction process so you're informed of whether it's going to work for you and how to take the best advantage of it. So, how many open house inspections do you need to sell a property, and how many in total would a good agent do in a week? We'll jump to you first, Damien.
Absolutely. So, look, there's no hard and fast rule as such. Different agents have different strategies. I personally, for a campaign, always like to have a 1 to 2 week period where you're bringing people through from your database. I mean, agents are always banging on about, we have the buyer. So it'd be silly not to follow up on that promise. So 1 to 2 weeks of bringing people through that are qualified. If that materialises into an offer and or a sale, great. If not, then it's generally a 4-week campaign and you'll have 7 to 8 open houses in that window.
Right, OK. Charles, what are your thoughts?
In some areas you could almost have an auction within 48 hours of listing a property for sale because there are that many people backed up to buy. And if the agents have done their job correctly and they've kept their database in order and they've maintained contact with those people, they're going to know, just as Damien said, it's a very short-term process at the moment. In some areas it's an incredibly long-term process and auctions are never going to work. It's about whether we can get the price down to meet the buyer's expectations. But in certain areas where there's a minimal amount of stock, it's a wonderful time for a seller to take advantage of a very, very competitive marketplace. As you would know, you're trying to buy property yourself, how incredibly difficult it is.
But again, I guess it's selling it for the right person and the right property in the right location, because auction isn't going to be perfect for everyone, is it?
Well, it's not. And we always talk about the fact that if you've got 10 homes for sale in an area that are of similar kind, a buyer's not going to go out and get a valuation done, get pest building report done, get everything prepared to go to bid at an auction, because there's probably not going to be anybody there to bid against them. And so they'll just go down the road, make an offer, sign a contract and move on. And so in that case, and I've always found that when I was auctioning myself most of the time, it becomes very difficult. The closer to the city, the better the location, the easier it was for me as an auctioneer to present.
Now, obviously a lot of sellers think, oh, you just chuck an advert on realestate.com and it's pretty much done. I guess what's the difference between, I guess, selling it to an average buyer or having those qualified people on your database? What difference does that make to the seller?
Look, I think for the most part, if you've got a pool of qualified buyers, generally they're a bit more aggressive. They want to be on your hit list. They want to be the first to know about the property. And quite often you can actually get a premium out of those buyers. They don't want to have to go through the rigmarole again of competing against the market. So as an agent and as a team, a collective with the vendor, you're well positioned to actually say, look, put your best foot forward, picture what you're actually going to spend at auction and do it now plus whatever. That's generally how we run the race there.
Now, obviously there's some people trying to put in pre-auction offers even if it is going to auction. How does an agent deal with that?
It's a very, very dangerous time at that point. In my personal experience, and I watched it happen and happen to myself and watched agents take properties off the market when they got an offer from very professional buyers who made an offer well beyond what anybody's expectations were, and all of a sudden the marketing by that agent, the campaign, all slowed down because the owner had an expectation, the agent had an expectation, and a week and a half before the auction or a week before there was no contract that was signed, and all of a sudden there they were stuck in the middle of nowhere, and the property sold for less than what it should have sold for. And I think that's the danger part of when you're getting a bid before auction, you really can't stop your campaign. You've got to press on as hard as you can. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble.
Damien, what can happen if you literally have not a single person at auction?
Look, I think for the most part, don't lose face. There's going to be a reason for that. I mean, there's 3 things that sell a property. It's price, presentation and marketing. So if you've ticked off presentation and marketing, which most people do on the advice of the agent, then really the only thing left is price. So I think you need to sit down with the owner, have the hard conversation, which you should have actually had earlier on anyway, and just realign the price with the market. And by that point, 4 weeks in or thereabouts, you're going to have some pretty hard, tangible evidence as to what that actual price is and whether the owner wants to meet it or actually just park their plans for a while.
So you're an expert at it, because if you're talking that way, that's the way it should be. But you and I both know the majority of real estate practitioners start to get scared when they don't get the interest in a property. They go into hiding.
Yeah.
I don't know quite what it is, but as an auctioneer, when I'd stand up at a lectern, I knew when I couldn't see the agent that was representing that property in an auction room, or I could see some eyes hiding behind a palm tree somewhere in the corner, that I was in trouble as an auctioneer to try and get a result. I knew they hadn't done their work with their seller.
Yep.
I knew they hadn't educated their seller to the marketplace, and that's unfortunately what an average agent would do.
And I guess this would be a good question for Tom if we had him there, is if you're an independent auctioneer, would you worry about what agents you've got on the books? Because if you've got a whole bunch of agents that aren't that good, they're going to make the job 10 times as hard.
They do, and I always knew the same thing. There was one particular agent in an area in Newtown, and every time he bought a property at auction, I knew it was going to sell. It was just like you'd stand up, knew he'd done his work, and then there were the others, and that was so tough. The marketplace is different today in terms of the inner west or the top suburbs around Australia. But when I was auctioning in rooms, you'd get 30 different properties, and they could be anywhere from southwest to inner west in some cases, and it was just so difficult being the auctioneer. Auctioneers, if you look around, there's so many of them coming in the last 2 or 3 years. We've tripled the size of auctioneers in Australia.
Yes.
All of a sudden, 50% of them are out selling real estate again.
Yeah.
You watch that, notice that now. So things have changed.
Now, obviously in the media, there's a big concentration about selling over reserve. So I guess the question is how does a good agent sell over reserve? And does actually the reserve mean anything? Because ultimately it's the seller that dictates what it is, isn't it?
Yeah, look, very much so. And the reserve is a combination of market feedback, what the actual agent puts forward as his or her recommendation, and of course the owner's expectations. I guess I had an auction on Saturday. The reserve was $950. It actually sold for 1.218. Now the reason behind that was the owner took my advice. We did what we thought was a very conservative guide throughout the campaign. It was a deceased estate. The motivation was high to very high to get the result done, the job done. But it wasn't misleading in any way, and I want to make note of that as a disclaimer, because the reserve actually was $950, so the guide was consistent with the reserve. But given the market conditions and the buoyancy at the moment, there's no recommended retail price for a property. Things happen, and that's another example of what can happen in the eastern suburbs.
I saw a deceased estate one. The heading on the advert was "Deceased estate, owner said sell." So there you go, fresh from the owner's mouth, ready to go.
But again, you need something to set it out, and there's a certain amount of the population that will go just purely because it's a deceased estate.
Mortgagee in possession, mortgagee sale, that was always one that attracted people because they thought they were going to get it cheaper. Deceased estate, they're going to get it cheaper, but
divorcee or whatever else, and then they pay over the odds.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump to the numbers, Charles. What's happening with the auction clearance rates?
Slightly lower than this time last week, Chris. They were 77.5 last week, so they dropped down to 75.6 on a national basis. I mean, that's not such a big deal, but this time last year they were 60.8% on a national basis. So that's the interesting part. We're still doing so much better. Sydney came in at number 1, again at 81.2, followed by Melbourne at 79.4, and Canberra again. We think the Donald Trump factor hasn't impacted on Canberra too badly. Canberra came in at 71.2% also, so they're pretty good stats when you look at them overall. Pretty good rates.
Now, the one we really want, though, is there any properties coming on the market?
Yes, normally it slows down coming up to Christmas time, but we're still getting that slow increase each week. It's been only a small incremental increase. This week is 0.96% increase over this time last week. New Zealand, which seems to fluctuate, and given the earthquake and the problems they've had there, it's not surprising. In some areas you can't even gain access to the CBD in some parts to even sell property, and some of the insurance companies have stopped insuring property. So in other words, if you're in the middle of trying to complete a transaction, you can't go ahead. But their market went back 6.5% in stock this week over last week. So they're having a bit of a tough time in terms of stock.
Certainly going to be tough in those kind of markets. What about rent price movements?
The big jump this week. It was a jump of 1.18%, which is now 2.88% since the start of the year. Best performer came in was Darwin, which has been going backwards, and that came in at 2.03% up over this time last week, and that was followed by Sydney at 0.96%. The worst capital city was Hobart at negative 1.66%, but that's no big deal. The market's been pretty much up and down over the year to date, so I think overall the rents are still very stable. Still very
And then
stable.
finally, the vacancy rates.
Yeah, real good. Perth, I was worried about last week, reached 10%, 10.66% last week, down to 9.4% this week. And that's followed by Melbourne at 3.01%, and the best performer is Sydney at 1.39%. You're an accountant, add the three up together, divide it by 3. What do you get? 4.6% for an average for the three capital cities. There you go, Chris.
Perfect. Wonderful. Now, just as a quick question, Damien, quite often people say silent sales. Why would someone want to sell before it comes on the market? The buyer's agents always say one thing, but what about from the agent's perspective?
Look, I think silent sales suit certain people and certain motivations. I think for the most part, there's a sector of the market, more so the high end, that wants some privacy involved, and they don't want their address advertised and anyone just walking through. And other people just want to dip their toe in. You know, they're not sure if they're actually going to get their price. They don't want to invest 10 or 20 grand and tear that up potentially. So it might be opportunistic for them to say, look, Mr. and Mrs. Agent, bring your top 6 people through, see what you can deliver. If you get a result, great. If not, then we're just going to stay put and go to plan B.
And the final 20 seconds, Altona selling for 60 million and 27 million at the Opera House, 45,000 a square metre. What do you think about that?
What are you talking about?
Altona in Point Piper.
Oh, sorry, I was just about to answer that last question and you threw that at me. I have no idea. Thank you very much for asking.
Never mind.
Yeah.
Charles Tarbey, Century 21, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Damien Steele,
Pleasure.
Thanks for joining us
Welcome.
as well. Thanks for joining us at home. We'll be back next week. Until then, I'm Chris Gray. Good night.
The information featured in this program is general in nature and therefore should not be relied upon. Guests appearing on the program may have commercial arrangements with some of the companies mentioned. Before making any investment, insurance or financial planning decisions, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you.